Hey, friends. Thanks so much for joining. Welcome back. For those of you, it's been a little bit. I know I was on a little bit of a hiatus here, but I really appreciate you all watching and tuning in to SpiritYOUality. I have a friend of mine who I've known for the last year or so, a couple years now, I think, Kalie. Kalie, thank you so much for joining us today, and excited to just kind of riff and have people get to know you and have the good fortune of getting to learn from your brilliant mind. I always enjoy our conversations off the record, and so it's going to be fun to get other people in on this one.
Yeah, thanks for having me. And yeah, we met by me showing up at your house one day.
This is true.
It was planned, but yeah.
We'll leave people guessing
what happened there. I just showed up one day, and then we stayed in a house together for 3 days.
This is true. True, all factual.
Yeah.
And there may have been some event that involved, a bird or of some kind
in the middle of summer.
Oh wow! But that was a great time, interesting time. Lots of things to even unpack with that.
Yeah, definitely.
Josie was on a little while back, and that's also how I met Josie.
Mm-hmm.
So shout out to Josie. For those of you who didn't watch that episode, go back and check that out. But for those of people tuning in who don't really know who you are and what you're up to in the world, tell us a little bit about yourself, Kalie.
Yeah, so currently I am the Director of Communications and Digital Outreach for the Center for Prophetic Imagination, which is a nonprofit that focuses on education centered around socio-spiritual discernment. And that's kind of a new term that we're kind of testing out, socio-spiritual. But it's really kind of this idea that, like, regardless of somebody's spiritual understanding of the world or their tradition, a lot of people understand that there are systemic issues in the world, and like a Christian tradition might say this is evil and Satan's influence or whatever, or some other type of understanding, just systemic things exist because of like white supremacy, things like that. But we're all kind of trying to put language to something that we're experiencing. And so that's what socio-spiritual discernment is. It's not necessarily saying a specific spiritual practice, but it's like once we move past the fact that we're all trying to put language to the fact that things are kind of shitty sometimes, maybe we could work together on getting things better. So yeah, that's kind of what CPI does, is education around that. But I've also been involved in LGBTQ plus activism, especially around the legalized discrimination that queer people face at religious institutions that the federal government still funds. According to Title IX, LGBTQ plus people are not supposed to be discriminated against while a educational institution is receiving federal money, but religious institutions are able to continue to discriminate and still get federal funding. And that's kind of messed up, because if you want federal money, you should probably play by the rules. But religious universities don't have to. And what's worse is, like, they can get an exemption for Title IX after the fact. So it's not necessarily even like, why are queer people going to schools that don't accept them? Well, they don't have to tell you that they don't accept you till after you file a Title IX complaint. And then they go to the government and say, no, we're a religious institution, we have an exemption. And the government says, oh, yeah, so, and then throw it out. So really, religious institutions are being intentionally dishonest about their treatment of queer people. So I've been involved with REAP, the Religious Exemption Accountability Project. Yeah, project. I'm also on the board of that now. So that's mostly been where my activism has been through and things.
Yeah, that I really wasn't aware of, that particular niche of corruption, for lack of a better term, that's happening. And it doesn't surprise me, which is so sad, that like some of these things that, the more that we peel back layers of the systemic issues that we face, like the more it's like, God, it's set up to benefit the people in power and continue to disadvantage those who are less fortunate and those who are marginalized within society. And so, what is some of the efforts that you're currently doing with the aforementioned organization? I think you said, was it REAP?
Yeah, REAP.
And then also CPI. Like, what does it look like for you to, is it through education, or is it like a number of different events that you're hosting? Like, what does that look like at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, so REAP right now is really focusing on more grassroots type things. It started with the Hunter v. Department of Education lawsuit. That ended up getting thrown out with the judge saying, yeah, there is significant harm being done to LGBTQ plus students. They are in fact facing discrimination. There just isn't any legal standing to sue, which is completely ridiculous to say, yeah, this is happening, but there is no legal recourse. Like, so, but since that has kind of that part is kind of done, they're focusing more on grassroots efforts and community building, especially for LGBTQ plus people in religious institutions. And yeah, so that's a lot of REAP's focus. CPI, we are kind of shifting focus. We have been very kind of inward focused in the sense that, like, our big thing has been a 2-year spiritual direction program that once you finish it, you have a certificate in spiritual direction. And it's kind of like it's not necessarily accredited. It's more for like self-improvement and things like that. And we've had pastors, like chaplains, but also like people who do social work and things like that to really get a better understanding of how spiritual discernment kind of works its way in the world and is applicable to like real life situations, and kind of thinking differently about spirituality and systemic issues that exist in our world. But we are also currently trying to shift to be more outward focusing and offering more resources kind of to the general public. Not that like the program was closed off to people, but it's like once you get into a 2-year program, like that's kind of your focus, and it's like a group of people that you're focusing on. So we're kind of wanting to get more education out to the broader public. So we're kind of in a shift at the moment. Yeah, but education is kind of our biggest thing, and reframing spirituality in a way that like addresses a lot of the issues that we're facing in the world that's kind of led to the Christo-fascism that we're seeing today.
And so when you say reframing spirituality, if you were to kind of flesh that out a little bit, how would you define that, or maybe paint a picture of what that looks like from your current standpoint?
Yeah. So this last year, or this this last like 6 months ago, I taught the course on Christian mysticism for the spiritual direction program. And the one thing that I emphasize the most is, in a sense, every practice is mystical. Like if somebody is trying to connect with the divine, that they're aligning themselves with the divine and the world around them, it is in some sense mystical. The reason that we separate our kind of like mystics versus like laity type differentiation is because these people seek out connection with the divine and the world around them through methods that are not traditional. Like you think about the Desert Fathers who like went and lived literally in the desert. Like Simeon Stylites lived on a pillar. Like these are things that are out of the normal, but there is more than just that. Like Catherine of, dang it, I forget of where, but like she's the one who like believed that she had Jesus foreskin as a wedding
Oh,
ring.
yes.
But that was also part of like this deep spiritual practice that she held. There's Rosa Gypsiaka, who believed that she, in a sense, nursed Jesus and then became the feminine version of Jesus, which, like, to us sounds like incredibly, like, almost insane. Part of the issue is like we don't know how much that is true, because her story was written by the Inquisition, not by her. So like, not
Yeah.
necessarily the most reliable of like the people who are finding reasons to murder people, right? Like a lot of this stuff could be metaphors, but she like led an underground resistance of sex slaves in her community, and really connected with something that was liberative for the people that kind of followed her, which is kind of a weird long way to get to the point where essentially being mystical means to step out of the status quo. And that's going to look sometimes in very like countercultural ways, like the couple of instances that I told you. But then there's like people like Sojourner Truth, who was a mystic. We don't necessarily always think of her as one, but who led radical transformation, but it was still against the status quo. So Sojourner Truth, dealing with the setting that she was in, acted outside of what was spiritually acceptable. And I've been kind of posting about this on Threads. Is like biblical Christianity at her time was pro-slavery. That was the status quo. And whenever you have a status quo within religion, that's called orthodoxy, because orthodoxy is the generally accepted practices and beliefs.
Right.
So slavery was orthodoxy. To act outside of orthodoxy is to practice heresy. All of these people practice heresy. And so my framing for that class, and kind of for anything I'm going to be teaching on queering spirituality in a few weeks at the Queer Christian Fellowship. But when it comes down to it, engaging in our world today means stepping against the status quo of, well, in Christian traditions. I'm not speaking to other traditions because that's not my tradition. Stepping out in spirituality means stepping against the status quo. It means stepping against orthodoxy, and it means being a heretic.
Absolutely. That's I love, that perspective. And I know we got to talk a little bit about that not long ago in one of our longer car rides. And, and it's something that has resonated with me. I mean, before I was doing this podcast, as you know, and many others, my wife and I started Your Favorite Heretics, and it went from taking something that was often a scarlet letter meant to ostracize and push people away and put, essentially gatekeep the divine. It turned into a badge of honor for me. And, it became a tongue-in-cheek thing. I was like, hey, like, if we're going to be heretics, if we're going to be labeled in this way, can we be your favorite? Like, but what that sent me on a journey, as well as looking back at some of, how orthodoxy came about and understanding church history and a lot of the politicalization of theology, and again, from the very early stages of the formation of the canon and everything like that, you have Rome and empire in general, right? That's taking these steps to control through a means of what's deemed acceptable to believe, right?
Yeah.
And I am fascinated. I think that a lot of people, especially I guess in Protestantism and much of evangelicalism, will have this high regard for Martin Luther. But, that's a classic example of somebody in church history who dared to step into the confines of heresy. And, that is one of countless examples who the history of the church have said, you know what, in order for there to be progress and change, in order for me to feel like I am being faithful to my spiritual journey, and how I understand my tradition, and how it plays out, I have to go against the popular orthodoxy, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And as you pointed out, orthodoxy, if we're being intellectually honest, it's a constantly moving target. And
Mm-hmm.
I laugh, and I know that you've heard this too, about people who just haphazardly use things like the Bible is clear and and things of that nature. You know, I'm sure maybe some people who are coming across this, maybe they've not thought about things from this perspective, but you know, for those who have been kind of conditioned to think of scripture as this kind of univocal, singular sort of collection of ideas that
Yeah.
happens to agree with everything that they're approaching the text with, how would you push back against that and challenge that?
I mean, kind of the biggest thing is like it's a text with ancient language that's been around for thousands of years. And anybody who studies language, I was a linguist for 9 years in the military. Everything is an interpretation. And it is impossible to have a perfect interpretation, even between English. So whenever I use language, I am putting sounds to a concept that I have in my head, which uses language that has connotation that means something to me, and then it goes into your ears and you hear those words, which are just sounds with connotation, and you bring your own connotation to those words and interpret what I say. Now, we have the same language, so our understanding and connotation of the words being used is probably relatively similar. So we probably don't necessarily have too much difference between my intended message and the message that you receive. But you are still doing interpretation simply on what I am saying currently. Now we add different languages and 2,000 years of development at minimum, you're going to have something completely different. One of the favorite things that people in linguistics like to joke about is like, in 100 years, people might not know the difference between a butt dial and a booty call, right? Very different meanings, but literally like basically the same thing. So like we're doing that with the text, saying like we know for sure that 2,000 years ago, the way that we understand these words is what they meant, like completely devoid of possible like euphemisms, colloquialisms, things like that. Like we've got to understand that we don't know what this text is literally saying. Every translation is a best guess at most. Like the fact that we aren't being honest about that is incredibly problematic, and we run into that within English translations, especially because like people deify the King James version still, like, which was heavily reliant on the Vulgate. And if you've done translation work, you know that the Vulgate was like somebody took freshman Greek and then wrote in Latin. Like, it's not the best translation, and it's mostly built off the Septuagint and the Old Testament. So it's problematic. And then you have people reinforcing it, like Augustine was like, as far as I'm concerned, the original manuscripts of scripture are 100% correct. However, I know that I don't have access to those because I don't know Greek.
Yeah.
Like,
and from what I understand, he went as far as even saying like he doesn't care about Greek. Like it wasn't even I don't know Greek. It's like I could care less about it. It's like he didn't even.
I mean, I don't know how true that necessarily is in like words that he said, but at the same time, like he was being paid to be a theologian. Like he could have taken the time. So like, if he didn't say it, he lived it out. But yeah, so we're dealing with 2,000 years difference of like, we don't actually understand this language. But then add on top of that, we are speaking English. English is fundamentally a Christian theological language. When we use common English words, many of it have theological implications behind it. When we talk about evil, we fundamentally, as English speakers, think of evil as that which is against God, that is demonic, right? Like, we don't actually think of it as harm being done to others. We think of it as something that a devil would do. Like, that is that is how we think of evil, which isn't necessarily the best way to think about evil. We talk about sin. Sin is not a biblical concept. There is the definition of the word sin that we use in English, and the connotation that we mean when we say the word sin, does not have an equivalence in the Greek or Hebrew Bible. So whenever we see the word sin, which in the New Testament is mostly hamartia, which was most commonly at that time used in in plays, it was the action that led to the demise of a character, and it was more like, it was a morally neutral action. Like, it could be something that, like, they do something wrong and then that comes back and they end up dying because of it. Like, they steal something from somebody else and then somebody kills them, right? That would be hamartia. But also, like, they save somebody and then, like, later on down the line, that person accidentally, like, pushes them off a bridge. You know, I'm making this stuff up, but that was a morally positive thing that also led to their demise, right? It wasn't inherently an evil word. Now, when they're using it in the New Testament, like, it does have a negative connotation, but, like, it's also building off of, like, the concept of things that led to a negative outcome. And especially whenever you're dealing with an occupied people group in the first century who is under the oppression of the Roman Empire, and, like, they're looking at their history and they understand their history as, you know, we didn't follow God, and thus God allowed us to be destroyed by the Babylonians, and then we're under the Persians, and then the Greeks came, and then the Romans came, and they are viewing their current their current oppression as the result of having done wrong things. That was what sin was. So, like, whenever Jesus shows up, and in Matthew 2, maybe it's Matthew 1, and it says that Jesus would save his people from their sins, like, that's what it's talking about, is, like, the sins that led to their oppression and occupation under the Roman Empire. It's not this thing that sends people to eternal conscious torment in hell, all right? And also, hell's not biblical either. Yeah, another English word that doesn't exist in the Greek or in the Hebrew at all. So, like, we're using language that we fundamentally understand to be Christian that has no precedent in Scripture, and we are talking and utilizing this language, and it reinforces our understanding that we are bringing to the text and bringing to our lives and bringing to the way that we interact with other people. And so it is a system that continuously, like, it's a cycle that continuously reinforces very Christian, specifically, like, European Christian understandings that we can't hardly escape.
Yeah, I mean, it to me, it all goes back to this persistent need, or not even a need, I would say this addiction to certainty that exists within a lot of Christianity, and a lot of how, you know, American Christianity in particular has devolved, you know, going back to language, you know, having the ability to say, we really don't know. We can take our best guess, you know, interpretation or translation is interpretation. We're doing the best that we can. And that's okay. Like, making peace with that's such a fundamental aspect of, you know, to use a commonly understood term like deconstructing,
Mm-hmm.
is to really say certainty that we were promised with having this systematic theology, or the series of doctrine that we were able to kind of turn our brains off and our critical thinking off and just sort of like subscribe to unconsciously. Well, the issue is that when you start to really take that seriously,
Mm-hmm.
you begin to run into some cognitive dissonance, and you begin to run into some problems that inevitably play out.
Yeah.
I'm sure you've heard it personally or secondhand as well. The accusation that people fell away or deconstructed because they just wanted to sin, or they just wanted to follow their flesh.
I mean, first of all, if people wanted to sin, they would just be an SBC pastor or like a politician. So crime is generally measured in number of instances per 100,000 people, right? So since I did the math, and I think it's 75,000 out of 100,000 United States presidents have been sexual predators. Like if we put it into the 100, because obviously there's been 8, I think, since I've been alive, but because crime is measured in per 100,000, you bump that up to 100,000 and it come out to 75,000 US presidents are sexual predators. Oh, my camera turned off. I'm gonna keep talking while I fix my camera. So like it's kind of really ridiculous to even say that somebody deconstructed because they just wanted to have sex or because they wanted to sin. Like it is ridiculous because people do like. I switched my camera around. Oh my goodness.
Yeah. Well, people do those things regardless, but I think that what we're both getting at is, this is, people will make that cheap accusation because they refuse to believe that it's possible for somebody to take their faith seriously and have it lead to them, having it completely unravel, and for them to get to a point where they're like, I'm okay not knowing certainly what I believe, and also being uncertain whether or not all these things we were convinced are objectively, quote unquote, true, are that black and white, because that's just not how life works.
Yeah. And so for me, I kind of had to just resign myself to kind of the understanding that like, if God is love, like, the Bible says, then if you seek God and come to the wrong theological belief, then a God of love is not going to care, right? Like if you're honestly seeking God and you come to the wrong theological conclusion, like a loving God is not going to care. And so like when we talk about deconstruction, like to me, that word doesn't necessarily fit because I didn't deconstruct per se. I studied my way into having better theology. And the truth is, you can do that. Like I used conservative hermeneutics and conservative exegesis to come to so many more progressive understandings that like really were just scared. Like what happens if we do actually change our mind on stuff is really what it comes down to. And we saw that with like Richard Hayes just passed away like not too long ago, and the last book that he published, he came out and was affirming, right? Eugene Peterson actually was affirming when he died. There are people that have actually put in the work and changed their minds. It's not unheard of. The problem is like you're kind of gonna lose your platform. So like Eugene Peterson and Richard Hayes coming out like right before they die is like they didn't risk too much. I don't think they planned on dying, but but like most pastors can't come back from that, right? Like you and I were friends with Justin Gentry, right? He was a pastor. like he'll talk about the fact that he couldn't stay in that field. Yeah, like once you realize that you're part of the harm, it's hard to stay. It really is, and that's scary. That right there is scary. Leaving the community, leaving kind of that assurity. Like if you stay in line, like you believe that you're going to go to heaven, this place of eternal bliss, which the Good Place breaks that down. It was like, yeah, this is actually heaven. They did a really good job of that. and it's super funny that conservatives' view of heaven is socialism, where like,
that's a whole podcast.
Yeah, it's hard. It's hard to leave whenever you are in a position where your livelihood depends on it, where your family is going to treat you different. There's a lot of us, especially millennials, who probably started leaving evangelicalism during the first Trump presidency, and we're getting ready for the second. So that mass exodus is about to get even bigger. Mm-hmm. That are having to put boundaries with family members because we just can't do it, and that's hard. It is incredibly hard, and so like it makes sense. It makes sense to not do the work, but I think it's important. I think it's important to making a better future, to having more harm reduction in our world, which is incredibly needed, especially with like the way that conservatism is like going right now. Like we don't just need, we can't get liberals to do anything. It's probably going to be the former conservative people that actually step up and make a difference.
Well, the fact of the matter, like you said, is that we're at another point in time that is significant. We're seeing this continued inaction in the face of fascism literally being at our doorstep.
Yeah.
Like a lot of terrifying policies being flirted with, and people's rights in jeopardy, and there's a lot of uncertainty in that, and a lot of fear that is floating around. I think, what would you say to somebody who is feeling like, I am struggling to keep my head above water as I'm not only just figuring out how the hell I see, my faith and all of this stuff, but how to keep pressing forward in the midst of like very dark times that we're up against?
Honestly, I struggle with that myself. Things are really bleak. And the more that we think about it, the more that it looks bleak. Because it's true. Nobody is coming to rescue us. Mm-hmm. That is... we have a two-party system. One is a fascist party. The other is fascist light. And in a lot of ways, we didn't see that until the last year and a half. Where we found out that LGBTQ plus rights took a back seat to the money that you can make on genocide. And that's just a fact. Like, the reason TikTok is being banned is not because China's getting our data, because the Congress already talked about that and didn't care. What they did care about is that people got on TikTok and talked about the apartheid that was happening in Gaza, that the genocide didn't start October 2023. It had been going on, that illegal land occupation in Gaza, the removal of Gaza citizens, and the selling off of land that belonged to Palestine had been going on for years. And people talked about it. But the thing is, there is money to be made in Israel, because Israel is where we will use our money to buy our own weapons, to send them there to use them against another group, so we can test weapons. That's not a secret. We do the same thing with South Korea and North Korea. Like, it is a front to test out our weapons, to show the world, hey, we're super strong. And there is billions of dollars in that. And so whenever we started talking about the fact that Israel is doing an apartheid, that it is a genocide, politicians who have their pockets lined by our military industry jumped on that. And we are continuing to see that. This is the reason why Democrats voted to pass. I don't think it ever got signed into law, but giving the president the ability to remove nonprofit status to basically any nonprofit that they say is like supportive of a terrorist organization. Mm-hmm. And to be clear, being pro-Palestine is not being pro-terrorist organization. The average age of people living in Gaza is 19 years old. Do you know when Hamas was elected to be leader of Gaza? It was 20 years ago, which means the average 50% were not born.
Wow.
When Hamas did not get the popular vote, when you do the math, it comes down to, I did the math, but I don't remember off the top of my head. I believe it's somewhere between 4 and 10% possibly voted for Hamas that is still alive today. So to say I support Palestine and that equals Hamas, no. Like, you're talking about 95% of the population that had no choice in that election, plus, voter regret is the thing. But both Republican and Democratic parties support the genocide, make money off the genocide, are lobbied by the genocide, and they're okay with that fact. And we are seeing now that money, that power is still, regardless of the political party, the thing that speaks. And we are seeing Democratic congressmen who are throwing trans rights under the bus. And remember, 15 years ago, not that long ago, 15 years ago, the majority of politicians were against same-sex marriage.
Yeah.
Not Republicans were against it. Democrats were for it. It was Republicans were all against it. Some, probably about 50-50 Democrats were for and 50-50 against. So, like, we're not dealing with a progressive party. We're dealing with two conservative parties who uphold so much systemic issues within our world today that they are still upholding fascism within the United States. And we can't act like that fascism in the United States is a new thing. Nazi Germany copied Jim Crow laws in the United States. They said that the United States does it right. However, they're sloppy with Jim Crow because it's not very it's not very professional just to lynch people. You got to be a little more systematic about it and do it. Like, the United States literally inspired the Nazi Party. You have the double V movement after World War II, the double victory movement, where black soldiers went and fought in World War II, fought fascism, and came home and were like, oh, we still don't have rights. We still have fascism in the United States. So the double V movement was seeking to end fascism in the United States. Like, this isn't new. Part of the issue is more white people are being affected by it. And that is the real difference between early 1900s and now, because now it is queer people, and there are more queer people like out and proud, and that's a good thing. Women's rights have been taken away. But when it comes down to it, like, a major difference in why we're talking about fascism today as opposed to the fascism that has existed throughout American history is that it's affecting more white people. And that's an honest thing that we have to deal with. And yeah, when I say that, like, nobody's coming to save us, like, people don't want to accept that. We have to
Yeah.
accept fascism has been here. We see it more now because it's affecting more white people. It existed under Ronald Reagan whenever the AIDS epidemic was happening, and he made rule he made in a way that wasn't, but gay people were still a small enough minority, and because it was
Wow.
believed that it was affecting the black community more than the white community, it didn't become that big of a thing. AIDS does not discriminate, but the
Yeah.
cultural consciousness of that time was that it wasn't affecting white people as much. I don't think that was actually true, but it
Mm.
was, what people believe and what is real
It's
are
their
often two
perspective.
different things.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, we do have to deal with that on an entire, like, we have to be able to talk about the fact that we have screwed up in America, and this is one of the reasons why a lot of people don't like talking about our actual history. Our actual history is based on genocide.
Yeah.
That's a rough thing to talk about. Like, my history is, I have family that came over on the Mayflower. I have family that owned slaves, I think, in Texas. Like, that's my history. I also have some history in uh, the dang it, it it's one of the Blackfoot tribes. I don't know much about that because my family line kind of ignored that, and so I really have very little history on that. However, like, my history is very problematic, but it's something you got to deal with. Like, the reason we have the Second Amendment is to uphold a free society. Well, if you read the Declaration of Independence, having a free people was the grievances against King George. What were things that were causing them from being free people. The last one that they stated was King George wasn't letting them kill indigenous people as much as they wanted, and so the
Wow.
ability to genocide indigenous people was seen as needed to have a free society, and that's why, like, a free society under the Second Amendment is kind of there. Why they needed weapons was to be able to genocide native peoples. George Washington carried out a genocide against a native tribe. Like, this is our history. It's really, really fucked up,
Yeah.
and we're not dealing with it. Hyper conservative people want to hide their heads. Liberal people don't really want to talk about it either. The amount of people who actually have put in the effort in harm reduction over the last 4 years has decreased. The level of apathy that we have seen within liberal and leftist spaces and progressive spaces even has grown. The apathy is ingrained in who we have been. And granted, we kind of had to, like, live in our house and not go outside for like a couple of years. So, like, there are factors. However, we're dealing with a present danger, but it's one that has been here. It's one that's been fought against. First of all, I do want to highlight that. Like, I've said a lot of, like, hyper negative things, but the fascism in the United States has always been fought against, and it slowly is driven away. It comes
Mm.
back, and it is driven away. It comes back again, but it does get driven away. But it is driven away by people willing to step up. It is done by people willing to take to the streets. It is done by people who are willing to talk to your family members and be like, "Hey, I don't think you understand the issue of trans athletes. Let's talk about that." Because, like, being a trans person, a person that wants to hate me is not going to listen to me. It is going to be up to cis people to advocate for trans people to the average person.
Yeah.
It is going to be a thousand little steps. It is going to be a thousand little steps in our own community, in if we are in a church, if we are part of any group, to reduce harm in those spaces, to go back to a time where like, hey, actually that joke's not funny. Have people think about that. Like, yeah, you know, making jokes about other people actually isn't a positive thing. It is difficult. You might lose friends, but I'm sorry, at the end of the day, like, you losing a friend is not as bad as somebody else losing rights, not as bad as
losing their lives.
And especially whenever we talk about trans issues, so I want to tread a little carefully here, because it is a fact that trans people do have a higher percentage of attempting suicide, a very high percentage. And people will use that to say, see, it is a mental illness.
Right.
If you take the majority of what is in the public atmosphere of what is being said about a marginalized language, and you make it as dehumanizing as possible, you will succeed in having people kill themselves.
Mm.
That is absolutely going to happen. In fact, the truth of the matter is the fact that there are so few trans people have done mass shootings whenever trans people are, you know, alienated so much is actually kind of surprising. Like, most mass shootings are most school mass shootings are actually white males, cis white males, who get mad for not having friends, which sucks, and that shouldn't happen. But at the same time, like, trans people aren't killing everybody after like their teachers intentionally like humiliate them in front of the class. That is something that wears people down. It is violence against trans people. So yes, we are going to have a higher rate of attempted suicides because we live in a culture that wants us to die and treats us in a way where our death is seen as a positive for society.
Mm.
If you create that culture, you will have a higher likelihood of people in that group kill themselves. Those are facts. Now, using that fact to say that trans people shouldn't have access to gender affirming care is so incredibly fucked up.
Mm-hmm.
Like, to say we created your mental health issues, and because of that we are going to not let you have treatment that's going to make you feel better. We are not going to accept you. That is murderous. Mm-hmm. It is demonic. It going back to what we talked about earlier, that is evil. And the truth is, when it comes to trans people, accepting them because that helps them live longer and not kill themselves doesn't make you a good person. Mm-hmm. I'm sorry. That's what terrible people need to accept somebody. Being a good person is accepting somebody who's trans because you accept them, because you're a good person, because that's what makes them happy. Continuing to not accept them, even knowing that your unacceptance is going to cause them harm, it makes you evil. Like,
yeah.
And so we've created a world where we talk about trans people in the most negative light. The truth is, trans people should be able to exist because when we're allowed to, we thrive. We create a better, more creative world around us. Like, when you're stuck to very fixed thinking, there is no creativity. That, like, there's a reason why Christian music sucks so bad, right? Like, you're stuck in such narrow thinking. There is no creativity around you. Like, just the way that conservatism sucks the life out of everything because accepting something outside of a narrow framework is somehow sinful is messed up. and they have so much to learn from people who are different from them.
Absolutely. And I think that that last part is the key piece, is that when people don't understand, it's human nature to then go to fear, and fear then leads people to act in means of exclusion, and then like choosing to not engage with somebody else. So for somebody who has been conditioned in conservative ideologies, it takes a tremendous amount of courage, but also it's a necessary thing for them to be willing to admit, hey, how I see the world is directly harming other people. Am I willing to say I care enough to love and to, put my thinking aside for a second to humanize the person who may have a different experience than me, but may actually teach me that there is a better way of moving through the world. There is a better way of understanding, humanity, spirituality, the divine, even scripture and theology. Like, it doesn't, if your theology causes you to exclude and hate and reject other people, that should be a glaring red flag that you are believing the wrong way. Yeah. So I really appreciate what you shared, Kalie. And, I think that, while certain words are often used in different contexts, I think evil is a very appropriate word for those who are willing to hold on to what they believe rather than protecting, ensuring the thriving and vitality of people who are constantly faced with real oppression. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, do you have any final thoughts that you want to leave people with? I know we're kind of nearing the end of our time together, and I really do appreciate everything that you shared. Yeah, would there be anything that you want to leave people with?
Yeah, I mean, so for people who are going to be at the Queer Christian Fellowship Conference, I will be presenting on Friday, the 24th, whatever the Friday is that weekend that's happening, on queering spirituality. I'll be talking about some myths of Christianity that we've bought into as a society, and about being a heretic and allowing your spirituality to step outside of the status quo. I'll only have an hour for that, so it is a lot to cover. But yeah, if you're going to be there or you're going to be there virtually, I will be doing a breakout session on Friday. Let's see, Thursday, whenever this comes out. So Thursday, January 16th. So figure out when that will be or was, depending on when this is being watched. I am finally publishing a blog on the historical evidence that Joseph was a gender expansive person. So Joseph, the grandchild of Abraham, looking at the story in Genesis, comparing that with historical evidence of the presumed setting of that story, which is right around the end of the third dynasty of Ur, Sumerians in the old Babylonian period. Which, if this is going over your head, that's fine. But essentially, it's looking at the fact that during that time period, cultures had an understanding of gender expansive people and had a place for them in society. And there's actually indications in Joseph's story that they fit kind of that framework. Obviously, it's an ancient story that was passed through an oral tradition, and we can't say anything with an ancient from an ancient setting with 100% certainty. But kind of the conclusion is like it is equally as is equally as wrong to assume that Joseph was a cisgender person when the culture and the evidence says that that might not be true. But it's a lot, like, I put a lot of work into it. It took me a really long time. In my Word document, it's 4 pages, single space, which isn't that much, like, lengthwise for me, but it's also supposed to be a blog. I normally my blogs are normally like 700 words, and this is close to 4,000. With like,
Might need to be a multi-part series even.
yeah, probably should have, but like 28 footnotes. Like, I put in the work to get this out. So check that out. It's gonna be on my Substack. It's gonna be dual posted on my Substack and the Center for Prophetic Imagination Substack. So if you subscribe to either one of those, you'll get it, or just go look for it. I have a website where you can find my stuff, which is just kaliehargrove.com. So it's super easy. And yeah,
I'll make sure to link that in the show notes too.
yeah. You can follow me on Threads. That's the only public, like, social media that I have. And what else? Oh yeah, support CPI, because it is a nonprofit organization that is trying to do spiritual work in a progressive space that is not the most popular space for funding at the moment. So yeah, at least follow us, share our stuff, get the word out. That helps a lot. But also, if you're able to, like, support us financially, that would be also amazing to help us keep going.
Awesome. Well, Kalie, I really appreciate it. Always take something away from our conversations. I'm sure people who tuned in did as well. Make sure that you follow Kalie and the places that were mentioned, and stay tuned for next time. So friends, take care, be good to yourself, and thanks again for watching SpiritYOUality.